So the title of my talk is called From Sanatana Dharma to the Sangh Parivar, Evolution of Political Hindutva. Through the ages, there have been several organized and outspokenly violent attempts to prevent the discussion of what constitutes political Hindutva, something which we have seen most explicitly in the light of this conference. And many of these attempts try to take shelter under the word Hindu without allowing the radical task of unpacking Hindutva to even commence. I speak here at the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, even after receiving death threats against my 4-year-old child. I speak here as someone who lives in India. I speak here even after I came to know that one of the organizations which has shot off a letter to the Prime Minister against this conference is linked to the Sanatan Sanstha accused in the murders of Gauri Lankesh, Kalburgi, and Narendra Dabholkar. These threats no doubt terrorize me. But the other alternative is keeping silent and allowing the political and ideological terror of an anti-minority, caste fanatic, misogynist, Hindu majoritarian nationalism to go unchallenged. This is true of the other panelists on this conference as well. I've always been convinced of the necessity to challenge, dismantle, uproot Hindutva, but there was a defining moment when it became absolutely crystal clear to me that those who propagate Hindutva have no respect whatsoever for the gods who could broadly be classified as belonging to the Hindu pantheon. It was a trivial but very defining moment. Sanghi trolls started rendering my last name, my father's name, also the name of Murugan in Tamil, Kandasamy, into Kantaswamy. I'm a feminist. I do not take the Kant as an insult. There are Sanghis who claim to be offended by attacks on Hinduism, but they have no qualms about insulting the faith of those who believe. If you are a pious Hindu who says Muruga Muruga when misfortune comes your way, please remember that your deities are only scapegoats and strawmen for these Sanghis. These Sanghis will be the first to insult them, the first to throw them in the bin, if and when it serves their political agenda. All that I ask is you hear me out with an open mind. What constitutes Hindutva? So I'm sure that others have, everyone, as Christoph said, has a different viewpoint. If one were to break down the toxic compound of Hindutva into its elemental form, there are two fundamental inequalities built into the system, into its philosophy and its daily practice: the oppression of caste and the oppression of women. I say this not as my own academic finding or as something I read as a research article. I say this in the feminist caste annihilation tradition of Mahatma Jyotirao Phule, revolutionary Dr. Ambedkar, Thandai Periyar, and most recently Dr. Tol Tirumavalavan, who all view the Hindu social order or Hindutva as a combination of caste inequality and male chauvinism. Why do we call it global Hindutva? This is a question that Professor Christoph Joffelot has addressed brilliantly, but Hindutva has always been carried away and borrowed heavily from its global influences, the Italian fascists, German Nazis, and most recently Trump. What I would like to say is that, this term Hindutva, I want to problematize it because there is a historical evolution that takes place from Sanatan Dharma to Brahmanism to Hindutva to a broader Sangh Parivarism. The basic concept of Sanatana Dharma, whose core ideology is inequality by birth. The philosophy of caste and patriarchy form the core of Sanatan doctrine. Often, referring to Sanatana Dharma has also taken the shape of calling it out as Brahmanism. After all, a particular community upholds the system of Vedic religion and espouses this ideology. In fact, this rejection of divine priesthood is the reason why religions like Buddhism and Jainism that came up against Brahmanism are today labeled as atheist religions by Hindutva forces. But as a minority population to uphold hegemony, it was important to bring all people culturally and spiritually under the umbrella of something larger. The construction of Hindu allowed this to happen, even as it also ensured the safety and security of those at the top of the caste pyramid. Even as Hindutva masks and hides itself in the cultural platform, under the garb of Hinduism, in the political platform, it seeks to polarize vote banks and construct a Hindu majoritarian nationalism. When we speak about political Hindutva, we are in fact speaking in particular about the Sangh Parivar, of which the BJP is only the political wing. Perhaps because the Hindu within Hindutva is being subjected to such scrutiny, we might as well call Hindutva as Sangh Parivarism. And then the question comes, why is the creation of internal enemies so important to Hindutva? How does this align with global Islamophobia? when the Congress party started to fight against British colonialism, there was a physical enemy. What the Congress in some way sought to do was to cultivate patriotism. However, under imperialism, where a physical enemy does not exist, where the enemies are virtual, where policies such as liberalization, globalization, privatization are being forced upon a nation, where imperial nations dictate foreign policy, economic policy, and business, Hindutva, which benefits greatly from capitalism, does not want to address any of these. Hindutva embraces neoliberalism, and any patriotism or inclusive nationalism is rendered irrelevant. What is instead important is to construct the internal enemy, sometimes the Muslim, or sometimes the Christian. And what are the multiple gains in this political strategy of polarizing Hindus? How does this help the traditional elite? Of course, without the help of the traditional elites, no fascist movement has come to power. So anti-minority sentiment is used as a strategy to polarize the Hindus. There are multiple gains to such an approach. It pushes the Brahmin versus non-Brahmin, or rather the Savarna versus Dalit Bahujana Adivasi contradiction to the backseat. Polarizing as a block of Hindus ensures the safety of the Brahmins, the tiny elite minority that benefits the most from Hindutva. It also allows everything that exists in India that is not Islamic or Christian to come under the single umbrella of Hindu. Radical religions that arose against Hinduism become Hinduism. Small village gods are appropriated. This sinister construction by the Sangh Parivar ensures that by default, the religion of the Brahmins, or rather, the religion that declares the supremacy of the Brahmins, becomes the religion of the majority of the people. And how does caste become foundational to Hindu majoritarian nationalism? Caste fanaticism is fundamental to the development and establishment of a Hindu majoritarian nationalism. When people begin to rally along the lines of language, ethnicity, or region, and when they rally alongside a demand for social justice, it inevitably leads to the dilution of the individual or specific caste identity. Under a broader egalitarian identity, caste identity begins to blur. When OBCs demand social justice and reservation en bloc, this struggle subsumes their particular caste identity. For the Sangh Parivar, however, caste must organize on their own, each independently, which is why Kongu Velalars must organize as Kongu Velalars, Devendra Kula Velalars must organize as Devendra Kula Velalars. They cannot organize under the broader rubric of an OBC or an SC identity. This leads to an inevitable situation where individual caste differences are sharpened, pushing towards a fragmentation on the basis of caste, and a consolidation, a uniformity under unity under the identity of Hindu. And this is where I want to argue, both as a feminist and as somebody who doesn't belong to this oppressive, as an anti-caste activist, that caste annihilation and feminism are inextricably interlinked, and they alone have the power to truly dismantle Hindutva. Where caste sentiment is developed, male chauvinism will sustain. The oppression of women is crucial to maintaining this caste order. Likewise, women who are feminist, liberated, and independent will reject the oppression placed on them by caste. In Tamil Nadu, the recent controversy around the Manusmriti, which I'm not entering here, I've written about it elsewhere, and I urge you to read it, brought to the fore why Hindutva wants to uphold the Manusmriti and everything that it represents. Somebody said that, yeah, they wouldn't mind replacing the constitution with the Manusmriti, but that's where we are. The political gains of Hindutva are not only used for power capture. Their dream is not just that BJP stays in power eternally. The political gain of Hindutva, which comes out of polarizing Hindus, is to construct a Hindu majoritarian nationalism. Only such a nationalism shall allow for minority hatred, for the suppression of women, for the perpetuation of caste atrocities, inequalities, and exploitation. Hindu majoritarian nationalism is what will empower them to implement the Citizenship Amendment Act, remove voting rights for whom they please, and to create any kind of demographic change that they want. What is the task of progressive academia in this revolutionary struggle against Hindutva? Dismantling global Hindutva also involves, within the space of the academia, resistance to appropriation. This is where I think the real academic task lies. In the Hindutva, especially the Sangh Parivar, has been extremely successful in swallowing up any discourse and tailoring it to their ends. Post-colonial discourse has been stretched like jelly to such an extent that many Sanghis proudly argue that caste was a British invention, a product of the colonial empire, and outside interference into an otherwise peaceful culture. They are not interested in nuance and complicating a question, merely in wearing the garb of theory to continue to uphold Hindutva, using white colonial presence to whitewash the atrocities of one's own society requires special terminology. Please come up with something for that. Within the latest against a trend of decolonization theories, there is a separate affliction or circus where British colonial regime is rejected not towards some egalitarian future, but to hark us back towards a so-called glorious Hindu past, a past where Dalit, Bahujans, Adivasis, and women were all denied education, where even 100 years ago, only 2 women in 100 could read or write in the Madras presidency. These are the same people who introduced the national education policy that takes us back to the oppressive Sanatana Manuvadi system of hereditary vocation. But the union minister will say this is an attempt to decolonize the Indian curriculum. An accused in the Malegaon terror blast, Pragya, will be invited as an eminent speaker to talk about the need to come out of the colonial mindset. Calls to reject colonial education and retrieve indigenous knowledge are being used in the most sinister manner by the Sangh Parivar. And the same people, likewise, the same people who decry and actively deny affirmative action to Dalits, Bahujans, and Adivasis when in India are the first to queue up for their turn under screams abroad. They project themselves as a minority. They attempt to silence any adverse criticism of the thousands of caste atrocities and rape culture that characterizes India. And by now, they have invented the new terminology of Hinduphobia. And last week, I was introduced to another one in this tiny family, Hindumisia. A writer whom I deeply adore, Audre Lorde, said, "The master's tool will not dismantle the master's house." The proliferation of the many overseas arms of the Sangh Parivar, combined with an already Hindutva-leaning, Brahmin-filled, Brahmin-dominated, Brahmin-supremacist academia in India, we see the tragic, frightening inverse of her prophetic words. The tools of the oppressed people are being used to stop the dismantling of the master's house and to hold it intact and together. This appropriation is what makes Hindutva deadly and dangerous. I just want to conclude. I'm a writer who regularly flirts with academia from a safe distance. I admire the courage that it has taken to put this conference together and the intellectual rigor needed from all of us to fight this ideological fascistic enemy, the Sangh Parivar. This battle to dismantle Hindutva has always been ongoing. And as we take it forward, I want to say this in conclusion, that as long as Hindutva exists, it would mean the perpetuation of the caste system and women's oppression. The task of dismantling Hindutva cannot occur without caste annihilation. It cannot occur without women's liberation. It cannot occur without a formidable challenge to capitalism. I know that a conclusion is a place where a writer or speaker makes the most effective point. I want to utilize the space of my conclusion to quote from Vidudalai Chirutaigal Katchi leader, Dr. Tol Thurmavalan's reading of Dr. Ambedkar in Uproot Hindutva, a book of speeches that I had the honor of translating. He says, "Revolutionary Ambedkar launched a multi-pronged attack against Hindutva. If all his writings and all his speeches are to be condensed to one line, it would read, 'We shall uproot Hindutva, we shall create equality.'" The essence of all of Dr. Ambedkar's writing is, we shall uproot Hindutva. Hindutva is opposed to equality, so we are opposed to Hindutva. Hindutva is against democracy, so we are against Hindutva. I close the quote, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.